Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 257. And this time I'm going to talk about Ornette Coleman's really quite remarkable record from 1961, Free Jazz, Collective Improvisation by the Ornette Coleman Double Quartet. The double quartet is, of course, two quartets, one in each speaker. Amazingly, there are actually five, I think, mono pressings of this record, which is a little baffling to me because if ever there were a record that needed to be in stereo, it's this one. It's got, of course, the Jackson Pollock painting on the inside, plus copious text, because of course this requires some explaining. This is a 1972 Japanese, the first Japanese pressing actually from 72. Sounds pretty good. Free jazz is something that often causes people to either just, look away or engage in an intake of breath before they start listening. But I can say from personal experience, if you suspend your prejudices and you actually dive in, it is actually something which is not only rewarding, it's actually kind of seductive. And truly, this record, while not friendly, predictable hard bop, is not necessarily as chaotic or inaccessible as you might imagine, certainly once you settle in. Despite being a revolutionary, Coleman also fits pretty neatly in the overall gradual development of modern jazz from 1945 to 1970. I'll leave it to real musicians to explain why atonality comes to rival tonality. Suffice it to say, for the lay consumer of jazz, the most important thing to know is that chords become less and less and less relevant in composition, and the boundaries around improvisation start to fall away, and the importance of improvisation, which was already important in jazz, just grows and grows and grows during this time. This record is the high watermark of Coleman's early, quite challenging flurry of recordings, particularly for Atlantic Records, 59, 60, 61. After this, he recedes from the jazz scene for a while, but this record, I think, is a must-hear to understand how 1960s jazz develops. I've talked about Coleman's early life and career in a previous review. He has, from the very beginning, a rather iconoclastic way of playing. He's brilliant, but he doesn't really stay inside the chalk lines, and as a consequence, band leaders aren't that keen on him, and sometimes audiences aren't that keen on him. And famously, he gets beaten up in Baton Rouge, has his saxophone broken, and he ends up, because he doesn't have much money, having to buy himself a plastic Grafton saxophone, which becomes the key sound of his early career. So he ends up out in LA, no job, not too many prospects in the early 1950s, but he falls in with a number of musicians who, like him, didn't really line up with the prevailing musical trends of the day. They didn't really fit. People like Don Cherry, who played the trumpet, people like Charlie Hayden, who played the bass, the drummers Ed Blackwell and Billy Higgins. Through his connections with Don Cherry, Coleman makes contact with Lester Koenig, the owner of Contemporary Records, and that is how he and his quartet come to record their debut album, Something Else, in 1958. Coleman had lots of big ideas, and he and his playing were impressing most of the people with whom he came in contact. But the label he was with, Contemporary, was a very small West Coast-based label, didn't have national reach particularly, let alone international reach like the big boys like Atlantic or Verve or Prestige or Columbia. However, things changed in 1958 when the Modern Jazz Quartet, that seminal modern jazz group, comes to San Francisco to play a few dates at the Black Hawk nightclub. Coleman finds out about this. He comes up from LA. The Black Hawk had a Sunday afternoon jam session, and he sits in. And these guys are blown away, particularly Lewis, who thinks what he's hearing is fantastic. He was well connected with Atlantic Records and with Nisui Erdogan, who is the part owner and the main jazz guy at the label at the time. And he says to Nisui, you got to sign this guy. He's out of left field, but this is really something new and exciting. And so sure enough, Coleman, on Lewis's good recommendation, ends up getting a deal with Atlantic. His first record for Atlantic was released in November 1959, and this is a key moment in the history of jazz because that same month, Coleman, Cherry, Hayden, and Higgins had gotten themselves a 2-week engagement at the 5 Spot in Greenwich Village, and that's basically ground zero at the time for cutting-edge jazz. It's one thing to be a big deal on the West Coast, it's quite another thing to land in the middle of New York and make a splash. And make a splash they did. This initial series of performances in New York has been called a pivotal event in jazz history. It's also commonly referred to as the Battle of the 5 Spot. From the get-go, Coleman and his quartet managed to piss off a large number of the giants of the genre, who at that point were feeling pretty good about themselves. Recall that in early 1959, Miles Davis, with John Coltrane and Cannonball Adderley and Bill Evans in tow, had released a record in Kinda Blue, which had moved the needle in terms of moving away from the expectations of hard bop in a way that felt revolutionary, but not too far. They still kept conservative jazz critics and regular mainstream fans of jazz on board. But Coleman's approach was far more radical, and it made everything that Miles had done, for which he'd been lauded in this cerebral approach to modal jazz, frankly seem like tinkering. When he heard Coleman, Miles confided in people that he thought Coleman was screwed up inside. Dizzy Gillespie felt that whatever this was, as he said, it was not jazz. Max Roach was so incensed by these performances, he actually went backstage and punched Coleman. But in contrast, other big names really loved what Coleman was doing. The influential critic Nat Hentoff was a champion from the beginning. Lionel Hampton thought it was great. Charles Mingus thought it was great. Mingus did one of those blindfold tests for downbeat, and his comment was, I don't believe the guy could necessarily play a C scale in whole notes if he had to, but I can tell you that when his records are played by a DJ, everything else, including my records, just sounds terrible in comparison. Following all this brouhaha, Atlantic releases a number of other records by Coleman. These include Change of the Century, which was actually recorded before all the excitement at the 5-spot. It was made in October 1959, but not released until May of the following year. And This Is Our Music, which was recorded in July and August of 1960. At the end of 1960, Coleman decides to take his experimentation one step further and heads back into the studio. On December 21st, 1960, Coleman and 7 other musicians enter A&R Studios in New York to make a record for Atlantic. Nasui Erdogan is the producer. The musicians were organized into 2 quartets. In the left channel, if you're listening in stereo, you've got Ornette Coleman on saxophone, you've got Scott LaFaro on bass, you've got Don Cherry on pocket trumpet, and you've got Billy Higgins on drums. In the right channel, you can hear Eric Dolphy on bass clarinet, first time actually he'd ever played with Coleman, Freddie Hubbard on trumpet, Charlie Hayden on bass, and Ed Blackwell on drums. They played one take of music for 36 minutes and 23 seconds. It gets split across the 2 sides of the record. The split occurs just as Don Cherry is starting to take his solo. It was composed and improvised right there in the studio with some agreement as to the sequence that the solos would occur in. But for the most part, these were musicians who had been playing together for years, often going back to the LA days, and so this was basically organic for them. On its release, in honor of the 2-quartet approach, Downbeat gave it 2 side-by-side reviews. Pete Weldon gave it 5 out of 5 stars, and John Tynan, probably the most conservative of the conservative jazz critics of the day, gave it a big fat 0. There are a few surprises here. The first one is this actually swings. I wasn't expecting this when I put the record on, but it does. The drums and the bass, both sides, provide a really solid rhythmic foundation for the whole performance. Surprise number 2, although not so surprising if you've heard what I've said so far in the review, is that this is actually a lot gentler and more accessible than a lot of other work which falls under the free jazz mantra. Surprise number 3, although again not so surprising if you think what Coleman was mining in doing all this, I'm often put in the mind of listening to New Orleans jazz bands, because in and amongst all of the improvisation and the genre bending and the boundary breaking, routinely you find yourself back in a kind of a call and response moment. The individual soloists are, to a person, remarkable. Dolphy's bass clarinet is just fantastic. Coleman gets, understandably, as he's a leader, more of the space than anybody else in the record. His tone is incredible, and his playing, his fluid runs are remarkable. But despite all of the side 1 pyrotechnics of the horn players, for me, the real revelations on this record come on side 2 when you get into the rhythm section solos. Hayden's playing is super innovative for 1960. He makes his bass almost sound like a Japanese koto, and LaFaro similarly introduces a technique which I don't think I've heard before or since, which involves a lot of very feathery strumming very high up in the registers of the instrument. Finally, the drum solos themselves are pretty cool. Like the bass solos, they're sort of mutually supportive, kind of a call and answer thing happening. And that's it. 36 minutes has flown by just like that. It's hard to have an open mind about free jazz, and I'm not going to sit here and claim that I'm some kind of Zen free jazz guru who's got the patience to sit through absolutely anything. I'm not. And in fact, I spent much of my music listening life mocking free jazz and making jokes about, 5 guys playing saxophone simultaneously and so on. So I get the critique. But I will say, when I sat down and decided to take it seriously and really listened, I was surprised by what I was able to hear. This record knocked the jazz world on its ear, and as I've said, it's really critical for understanding a lot of the jazz which comes afterwards. It's beautifully recorded, and as a record, it's pretty much unforgettable, whatever you think of it. As Downbeat anticipated, if this is your bag, it's probably 5 stars, and if it's not, it's probably 0. For me, it's closer to the 5.